On Saturday the 30th of June 1984, I was in Hampstead having lunch with a certain controversial writer of the day. I asked, how can we show that the world doesn't merely follow material cause and effect, but communicates meaning? He threw out his arms and said, all we can do is say, lo. Lo is all we can say. It's very hard to show people things. It's almost impossible to explain things to people. Words get in the way, not just when we try to talk about the world to others, but when we simply try to think about the world and our relationship with it. We might walk along and feel at one with the world, but as soon as we use words, things get complicated. We start making barriers. We probably don't notice that we're doing it. We so easily start saying, what does it mean, rather than seeing what something is. For example, if we look at a tree and say, God made this, we're suddenly making the tree an object, something out there, rather than something that's also alive in us. What do we mean by God? What do we mean by made? Are we suddenly thinking about a God who is out there, outside the world and us and the tree, who somehow makes things and puts them down over there for us to look at? We know nature doesn't work like that. We might even find ourselves saying, God made this for me. That's even more complicated. What does it mean? Is the tree ours to climb, to cut up for firewood? And the tree isn't a thing on its own anyway. It's one of many trees, sharing its DNA. It's an individual, but made what it is by being in that place, part of that wood, at that time, affected by its surroundings. More than that, we don't see an object anyway. It's not something out there that we analyse. What we know is that tree in that place on that day, seen through our eyes, our feelings and our memory. Just those few words have separated the tree from us and separated us and the tree from whatever God might be. We probably don't really mean any of this. If we think that everything comes from a common source, that everything has meaning, that we are part of the world made of the same stuff, even our thoughts and feelings, we don't have to use these words which create so many problems. We can just say, hello tree, and God is looking at the tree through our eyes. I've never really been very interested in nature as such. I'm much more interested in place. It probably goes back to long, long ago, when we used to be able to walk up the Twitton from my grandmother's house in Eastbourne, through the woods and onto the South Downs. So the Downs weren't just the rolling hills. They were also the stories of ancient people and their burial mounds and strange chalk hill figures. But the Downs were also being there on that hot summer day in 1962 and hearing the sound of ice cream van chimes from far below in the town, and the sound of Southern Electric trains heading across to the Weald. It was over 50 years later that I started exploring the landscape using music. Music is simply there to say "lo". You don't really need the music. It might help you just look at things differently, or at least it might stop you thinking and using unnecessary words. I explored the border country, Herefordshire and Wales, strange landscapes and peculiar churches. But the real epiphany, the moment of vision, of seeing something true on this adventure in the Welsh border, wasn't an ancient valley, an ancient forest, or a mysterious church. It was a shop window display in a small border village. Someone had collected those tins and those autumn leaves and put them there for me to see. This epiphany, this experience of a shop window, is a work of God. It might seem surprising that a great influence on me was John Bunyan. His puritanical kind of religion tended to make him want to abandon this world of vanity, and think only of the celestial city. But living in North Bedfordshire, it was impossible to forget that he walked those fields and along the river, preaching and baptizing. It was as if the landscape and those paths were the scene of the journey of the Pilgrim's Progress, and to walk on those paths was to take part in that story, in a symbolic, meaningful landscape. And more than that, the place and the story was associated in my mind with music, particularly Vaughan Williams' Fifth Symphony and his opera of the Pilgrim's Progress. So the music that I knew and loved was inseparably part of the same world as the landscape and the stories. The landscape, the stories, nature, and the music are all part of one world, and they all share a common language because they all come from one source, and they all follow the same inherent law, harmony. There is a hidden music in the world in which many things combine, like notes and harmonies, to make new works, and we're part of those works as audience or performer or co-creator, because we have the same harmony within us. Words aren't necessary to communicate meaning. St. Anthony of Padua was so inspired a preacher that people understood the meaning of his words even if they didn't understand the language. His sermons were like music, communicating pure meaning. In the middle of the 18th century, The services held in honour of St. Anthony at Padua and his miraculous tongue used music to represent the effect of his preaching. The great violinist Tartini played violin concertos, pure music communicating meaning. Tartini had studied at Assisi, and his search for a natural expressive music was inspired by ideals of Franciscan simplicity. We don't need words or explanations. This idea that music had meaning and value in itself went back to St. Francis in the 13th century. It's easy to miss the point of some of these old stories. This one is astonishing when we understand it. St. Francis was ill. He'd heard of a new kind of lute. He wanted to hear the music of this new instrument. His brothers were perplexed. Instrumental music wasn't approved of by the church. It was associated with dance and lewd goings-on. They couldn't bring themselves to do anything about it. So an angel appeared to Francis, playing the music of the new lute. An angel playing pure instrumental music on an Islamic instrument, music that communicated beauty, meaning and healing in itself. Music was central to the early Franciscans. They stood at the end of a very ancient tradition. The Basilica at Assisi was the first place with a specially composed choral liturgy. Franciscan music theorists taught the friars the use of the musical modes, so that their chants could communicate meaning to anyone, whatever their language. This was easy to understand in the 13th century, when the whole cosmos was seen as formed by music, guided by harmony. And in the Renaissance, when the Franciscan Francesco Giorgi published his massive book on the harmony of the world, in which everything is music. We might imagine the universe in a different, more literal way, but their older vision is still true. Harmony is a sign of the law that guides the formation of the world and allows it to form new works with all the creativity of chance and the unexpected. The 13th century Franciscans read Scripture and the world as lectio spiritualis, spiritual reading, as distinct from the lectio divina of the Benedictines. This meant that when we read Scripture or the world, we listen to our own feelings and imagination. We're listening, as it were, to the music happening within us. And ideally, this is something we do in a group, in company, as a shared performance. To Saint Bonaventure, the seraphic doctor in the 13th century, there were 4 kinds of knowledge to be gained from reading. We might begin with what the words of Scripture actually say. Then contemplate all the possible meanings and messages they might have within us. Then we read everything in the world in the same way, with feeling and imagination. We read the world, or I would say, we listen to its music. And finally, we let all these meanings, all this knowledge fall away and contemplate only the source of all being. Bonaventure was the end of this tradition. In his last book, he warned about the philosophers. After 1300, Western theologians and philosophers separated God more and more from creation. That's why the words we use can mean quite different things from the time of St. Francis. Let's just read the world. Let's join in the performance. Not just nature in the modern sense, but the whole world, everything. As with music, the darkest and most difficult things can be necessary to communicate truth. Beauty can be strange, even terrible. The world isn't out there. It's not an environment, something around us, or an object. We are in it and it is in us. We know the world and participate in it through our feelings and imagination. Some worlds might seem to be nature, but the work, the performance, is us being there, seeing and listening. The work is our walk through the forest. Some worlds are co-created by us, in harmony with nature. Some worlds might seem unnatural, but we can't say that. We are also part of the whole, and even the most unnatural and disturbing things and the most painful experiences might gleam with the spark of grace and truth. It's not easy to say lo. Some people might have clarity and innocence, vision. Most of us have to learn or rediscover. We need to know all the stories that make us, all the images and experience that mean something in every part of our lives, those things that have that spark of grace or truth. What parts of our own world do we neglect? We might study how things form, the language of music and nature. We might explore the world. Sometimes we sense a mystery, the mystery of something being formed, not a mystery to explain. We can follow the mystery. It might be a long journey, but we needn't travel far. We might take a close look at the world around us, or just one part, whether it's the stars or the smallest thing. The stories where we live, a garden, a tree, a poem, a favourite TV show, or a favourite cake. In all these, we explore ourselves, light and dark. Then we might be able to throw our arms wide and say, lo.